The moment Sloane leaned toward her friends and whispered, "The stinky country girl is here." I felt something finally give way inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, unmistakable snap of something that had been bent too far for too long. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel enough to protest, not sharp enough to draw blood, just soft and indulgent, the kind of laughter people use when they want to feel superior without feeling responsible. I stood there in the doorway of my brother's engagement ballroom, holding my clutch a second too tightly, realizing that I was once again the punchline in a story my family had been telling about me my entire life. What none of them understood, what not a single one of those well-dressed guests sipping champagne could have imagined, was that every crystal chandelier above their heads, every polished marble tile beneath their shoes, every shimmering screen preparing to celebrate Garrett and his perfect future, belonged to me. Entirely, legally, quietly, and I had owned it all long before the invitations went out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night didn't start with whispers or laughter or humiliation. It started weeks earlier, with an envelope that arrived in my mailbox like a small, deliberate test. Thick cardstock, gold lettering, my brother's name embossed like a brand. Garrett Whitmore and Sloane Avery request the pleasure of your company. Engagement celebration. Black tie optional. Family strongly encouraged. That last line might as well have read attendance mandatory if you still want to matter. I remember holding the invitation in my kitchen, rereading it twice, already feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, the reflexive calculation of whether going would hurt more than not going. It always did. And yet, like I always had, I said yes anyway. I had spent most of my life saying yes to rooms that never wanted me comfortable in them. Growing up, Garrett was the sun, and the rest of us were expected to orbit. He was charming, polished, ambitious in the way adults found impressive. Teachers praised him, neighbors bragged about him. My parents spoke about his future like it was a shared investment, something that would eventually pay off for all of us. I, on the other hand, was the practical one, the quiet one, the one who didn't dream out loud. I liked numbers. I liked systems. I liked working with my hands. Somewhere along the way, that became country. Simple. Less than. Nobody ever said it outright at first. They didn't have to. It was in the way conversations paused when I entered, the way my achievements were summarized quickly so we could return to Garrett's trajectory. By the time I left home, the roles were fixed. He climbed. I disappeared. That night, the ballroom was everything you'd expect from Garrett Whitmore's world. Expensive without warmth, elegant without personality, a space designed to impress people who mistook money for meaning. Soft lighting, neutral tones, a string quartet playing something classical and forgettable. I walked in alone, wearing a tailored navy dress I'd chosen carefully, not to stand out, not to invite commentary, just to exist without apology. It didn't matter. It never did. Sloane spotted me almost immediately, her eyes flicking over me with practiced efficiency, already sorting me into whatever category she'd assigned before we'd ever spoken. She leaned in. She whispered. And just like that, I was reduced to a smell, a stereotype, a joke passed between people who believed they were safe laughing. I didn't react. I never had. I simply took a breath and stepped further into the room, because reacting was what they expected, and I had learned long ago the power of denying people what they wanted. Garrett appeared moments later, radiant in his tailored suit, arm around Sloane like she was proof of something. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a kiss on the cheek that felt like a formality checked off a list. "You made it," he said, sounding faintly surprised, as if I were known for failing to show up to things that mattered to him. Of course, I replied calmly. Congratulations. He thanked me distractedly, already scanning the room for more important conversations, already reassured that I posed no threat, no complication, no narrative risk. To Garrett, I was background, reliable, quiet, dismissible. The speeches began soon after. Toasts to love, to success, to the future. People clinked glasses and nodded along, comfortable in their assumptions. Sloane's friends whispered about venues and honeymoons. My parents beamed, proud in that way parents get when they believe one child's success redeems every failure they never addressed. I stood near the edge of the room, observing, as I always did, listening more than speaking, watching patterns emerge the way they always had for me. It was how I survived. It was how I learned. It was how I built everything they refused to see. At one point, my mother drifted over, her smile polite, her tone carefully neutral. She told me I looked nice. She asked how work was going, already halfway through the question before her attention wandered elsewhere. I answered simply. She nodded, satisfied, and moved on. The conversation lasted less than a minute. That was normal. That was family. What none of them noticed was the way the staff deferred to me without realizing why. The subtle nods, the quick responses when I asked for something small, the manager who hovered nearby a little too attentively. Ownership has a way of revealing itself in behavior long before words are spoken. I had learned that too. I watched Sloane criticize the wine selection without knowing who approved it. I watched Garrett boast about deals finalized inside walls I had financed. I watched people mock the country girl while standing in a room built on my signature. The screens behind the band flickered as the technician prepared the next segment of the evening. A slideshow, a highlight reel, smiling photos of Garrett and Sloane. Applause cued on command. The schedule was precise. I knew that because I had approved the vendor contracts myself. I knew exactly when the room would go quiet, exactly when all eyes would turn forward, exactly when the truth would surface, not shouted, not announced, but displayed calmly, professionally, in undeniable detail. Standing there, listening to laughter ripple across my own ballroom, I didn't feel angry the way people expect. I felt steady, centered, ready. Years of dismissal had taught me patience. Years of favoritism had taught me restraint. And years of silence had taught me the most important lesson of all. When people stop seeing you as significant, they stop guarding themselves around you. They had no idea the ground beneath them already belonged to the woman they were mocking. And in a few minutes, neither money nor laughter would protect them anymore. By the time Garrett's friends started circulating with their practiced compliments and their lazy curiosity, the room had settled into what it always became when my family hosted anything, a stage designed to prove they were doing better than everyone else, with me positioned as the harmless contrast. People approached me the way they approach a decorative chair, politely, briefly, without the expectation of substance. A woman in a silver gown asked what I did these days, and when I said, calmly, "I'm in operations," she nodded as if I'd confirmed I stacked boxes somewhere, and then turned her body away mid-sentence, already bored. Sloane took her time making her way over. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She had the confidence of someone who'd never been corrected in public and never had to pay for it. When she reached me, she smiled like we were about to take a photo together, and her eyes did that quick sweep again. Hair, dress, shoes, posture, like she was assessing the value of an object at an estate sale. "I'm so glad you came," she said, loud enough for the women beside her to hear. "Garrett worried you might, feel uncomfortable." The word uncomfortable landed with that gentle cruelty she was good at. Not unwelcome. not insulted, just uncomfortable, as if my discomfort would be my own weakness, my own failure to adapt to their world. "I'm fine," I said. My voice stayed even. I gave her the polite smile people mistake for submission. Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly, almost disappointed, and then she leaned closer, like we were sharing a secret. "We have seating for dinner," she murmured. "I put you near the back. You'll be more relaxed there. Less pressure. Less visibility," she meant. "Less chance I'd be noticed in the photos. Less chance I'd be mistaken for someone important." She straightened, returned to her bright voice, and added, "And don't worry, the catering staff knows where to find you if you need anything." Like I was the one who needed to be managed. Garrett appeared again, slipping in beside her like a matching accessory. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask if I'd heard what was being said. He smiled at me like we were fine and said, "Try to enjoy yourself tonight, okay? It's a big night for us." For us. Not for family, not for togetherness, for them and the audience they were performing for. Then, because he couldn't help himself, he lowered his voice and added, "And just, please don't bring up anything weird. No business talk. No history." History. The years they'd forgotten me in plain sight. The way I'd been treated like a family expense instead of a person. The way they'd laughed at my accent when I was younger. The way my mother used to joke about my hands being rough. The way Garrett once told a boyfriend of mine at a Christmas dinner that I was sweet but not exactly ambitious. "No history," he said, because history was inconvenient. History was evidence. I nodded once, slow and calm, because nodding was easy. Nodding cost nothing, and people who think they've won don't watch carefully. As the night rolled forward, the small humiliations came in a steady, predictable drip. A cousin I hadn't seen in years asked if I was still living out there, as if any place without valet parking was a wilderness. An older family friend told me, with sincere pity, that not everyone is meant for big success, and I watched my mother's face soften in agreement, as if that were a comforting truth rather than a cruel limitation she'd helped enforce. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I didn't defend myself. Because the thing they never understood about me was that I didn't need them to believe in me for me to build. Across the room, I noticed the Whitmores, Sloane's family, moving like they owned the place. Her father, Charles, had the kind of confident belly laugh that made strangers assume he was powerful. Her mother, Elena, wore diamonds that could have paid off a mortgage and spoke about legacy like it was a personal hobby. And her brother, Reed, kept slipping off to the side with his phone, his eyes sharp, his posture tense, the way men look when they're counting minutes instead of enjoying a celebration. That was the first crack in the perfection. I started watching them more closely, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop. I've always seen details the way other people see headlines. Charles Whitmore clapped loudly during the speeches, but barely looked at Garrett. Elena smiled at Sloane like she loved her, but her eyes kept scanning the room like she was measuring what this engagement was worth. Reed spoke to the event manager twice and pointed toward the screens behind the band with irritation, like something wasn't going the way he expected. And then, I saw it. A man in a dark suit near the back wall, holding a tablet, not drinking, not smiling, not socializing. He wasn't staff. He wasn't family. He was watching the room with the quiet focus of someone waiting for a cue. His gaze landed on Charles Whitmore and stayed there a beat too long, then moved to Garrett, then to Sloane. I knew that look. I'd spent years sitting in conference rooms with people like that. Compliance officers, investigators, auditors, People who didn't care about charm or reputation. People who cared about paper trails. My stomach didn't drop. It steadied. Because the suspicion I'd been carrying for weeks finally had a shape. I drifted toward the bar, not to drink, but to listen. Sloane's mother was talking to a group of women, her voice light, her smile sharp. "It's wonderful, really," she said. "Garrett is such a catch, and Sloane deserves stability after everything. We've been through so much as a family." A woman asked, "Everything?" Elena Whitmore laughed softly. "Oh, you know, business stress. People can be so vindictive when you succeed." Vindictive. That word again. The way powerful families describe consequences. I turned my head slightly, keeping my expression neutral, and listened as Charles joined them, speaking in a low tone meant to sound private, but not caring who overheard. "It'll be fine," he said. "The merger paperwork goes through next month. Once the assets are consolidated, the noise dies." The woman in silver asked, "What noise?" Charles smiled in that same easy, dismissive way Garrett did. "Just some nonsense. A few disgruntled partners. People get emotional when they don't understand the bigger picture." I felt the quiet heat of recognition bloom behind my ribs. Because I did understand the bigger picture. 3 months earlier, I'd been reviewing a set of contracts for one of my subsidiaries. The kind of routine work nobody thinks is dramatic until it exposes something rotten. A vendor's name came up that shouldn't have been there. A payment schedule that didn't match the deliverables. A shell company with a polished website and no real footprint. It bothered me in the way a crooked picture frame bothers you when everything else is perfectly aligned. So, I pulled the thread. One small search became 3. 3 became a map, a pattern, a network of consulting fees, advisory retainers, and strategic partnerships that weren't strategic at all. The Whitmores weren't just flashy. They were hungry, and hunger makes people sloppy. What I uncovered wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a minor ethical lapse. It was structured, intentional, repeatable. A con dressed up in language respectable people don't question because questioning would mean admitting they'd been fooled. And the part that made my hands go cold when I found it wasn't the money. It was the target. My family. Garrett, in all his golden child confidence, had been pulled into their world like a trophy fiancé and a convenient signature. My parents had invested through a private opportunity Charles Whitmore recommended. It was pitched as exclusive, safe, family protected. And because it came wrapped in Sloane's charm and my brother's pride, my parents didn't do what they should have done. They didn't verify. They didn't ask who really controlled the entities. They didn't ask who stood behind the contracts. They didn't ask me, because I was the country girl, the one who didn't understand real business. The irony was almost quiet enough to miss. By the time the band paused and the screens behind them brightened, I felt the room shift into anticipation. The slideshow was next. Garrett and Sloane's love story, their curated timeline, photos meant to make everyone clap at the right moments. Sloane walked past me again and, without looking directly at me, said, "Try not to hover near the front. It's kind of crowded." I nodded, calm as ever, and stepped exactly where I wanted to step, because the truth was already loaded into the system. The technician had already received my updated file earlier that afternoon, delivered with a polite smile and a signature that made him move faster without knowing why. The screens flickered. The first photo appeared, Garrett smiling, Sloane laughing, my parents in the background looking proud. The room softened, ready to celebrate. And somewhere behind the applause, the Whitmore's con, every lie, every transfer, every forged document, weighted like a match held just above dry paper. Because Act 2 wasn't about my humiliation anymore. It was about how quickly arrogance turns into overreach when people believe you're too small to fight back. The room didn't erupt right away. That's the thing people get wrong about moments like this. They imagine gasps, shouting, chaos. What actually happened first was silence, the kind that spread slowly, unevenly, like a stain soaking through fabric. The slideshow froze for half a second, long enough for confusion to ripple across faces, and then the screen shifted. Not to another smiling photo, not to another curated memory, to a ledger, numbers, dates, entity names, clean, unadorned, unmistakable. At first, people assumed it was a mistake. Someone near the front laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke that hadn't landed yet. Garrett frowned and leaned toward the technician, whispering sharply. Sloane's smile stiffened, her lips still curved upward while her eyes scanned the screen with growing unease. The Whitmores looked at one another, just briefly, the way people do when they're checking whether anyone else is seeing what they're seeing. Then the second screen lit up. Wire transfers, repeated amounts, round numbers that don't happen by accident, shell companies with overlapping directors, consulting fees paid to firms that shared addresses with empty offices and temporary mailboxes. The titles were clear, the formatting precise. Whoever had prepared this hadn't done it for drama, they'd done it for clarity. My mother's hand moved to her chest. My father leaned forward in his chair, squinting, as if closer proximity might change the meaning of what he was seeing. Garrett turned, finally, and looked at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With confusion. That was the moment I knew he truly hadn't known. Not all of it. He'd signed where he was told, smiled where he was coached, trusted the people who had praised him. He'd been arrogant, yes, dismissive, cruel when it suited him. But he wasn't the architect. He was the door. The murmurs began then. Low, rapid, people reading faster than they could process. A few guests quietly stepped away from their tables, phones already in hand, the instinct for self-preservation kicking in before courtesy could stop it. Sloane's father stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor, his face set in the tight, furious mask of a man who knows he's been cornered. "This is inappropriate," Charles Whitmore said loudly, his voice booming just enough to reassert control. "This event is private." The man with the tablet near the wall moved then, stepping forward with measured calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority doesn't shout. "This presentation is part of a preliminary disclosure," he said. "It was authorized by the venue's legal owner." That got their attention. Sloane turned fully toward me now, disbelief cracking through her composure. "What is he talking about?" she demanded. "This isn't funny." I met her gaze evenly. No smile, no triumph, just truth, finally allowed into the room. "I am the legal owner of this property," I said, "along with the holding company that manages its operations." Someone laughed again, reflexively, but it died quickly when no one joined them. Sloane shook her head. "No, that's not possible. Garrett would have known." Garrett stared at me, pale now, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. "You... what?" "I didn't hide it," I said calmly. "You just never asked." That was the moment the older woman near the back, one of the Whitmore's longtime investors, judging by the way Charles glanced at her, stood slowly, her expression tight with something that wasn't surprise so much as calculation. "Those transfer dates," she said. "They line up with the quarter we were told liquidity was tight." Charles turned toward her sharply. "This is not the time." "It's exactly the time," she replied, her voice steady. "Because if this is accurate, You used restricted capital without disclosure. The screens changed again. Emails. Short. Professional. Non-emotional. Instructions. Confirmations. A chain of approvals that led back, again and again, to the same names. The same signatures. Sloane's brother, Reed, swore under his breath. I watched him realize, piece by piece, that the reason he'd been kept out of meetings wasn't trust. It was containment. I hadn't done this alone. I never pretended I had. The man with the tablet was not an investigator, not officially. He was a compliance consultant, one I'd worked with years earlier when I acquired a logistics firm and insisted on a full audit no one thought was necessary. We'd kept in touch, quietly. When I brought him what I'd found, he didn't react with shock. He reacted with interest. "This isn't messy," he'd told me weeks earlier, sitting across from me in a quiet office. "It's arrogant, and arrogance leaves records." He'd helped me verify everything. He'd helped me structure the disclosure so that it was factual, non-accusatory, and impossible to dismiss as personal grievance. No emotion, no narrative, just data. And then there was the other ally, the one Garrett never noticed because he'd stopped looking at people who didn't flatter him. Marianne Hales rose from her seat near the center of the room. Mid-50s, unassuming suit, minimal jewelry. She'd been quiet all evening, declining wine, observing. Garrett had introduced her as a friend of Sloane's family. Nothing more. She cleared her throat gently. "I'm afraid this is accurate," she said. "My firm was brought in 2 weeks ago to conduct a silent review after an internal whistleblower raised concerns." Sloane turned toward her, stunned. "You said this was about restructuring." "It is," Marianne replied evenly. "Just not the kind you were expecting." Garrett sank back into his chair. The room had changed by then. People weren't watching the screens anymore. They were watching each other, assessing proximity, calculating exposure, deciding who to distance themselves from first. My parents stood frozen, their faces etched with something between shock and grief. I moved toward them then, placing a hand on my mother's arm, grounding her. "You didn't know," I said quietly. "None of this is on you." My father's voice shook. "Our savings are accounted for," I said, "and protected." That part mattered more to me than anything else in that room. Charles Whitmore tried again to regain control, his voice rising, sharp now. "This is an ambush," he snapped. "You had no right." "I had every right," I replied, finally letting firmness into my voice. "You used entities I own. You routed funds through properties I control. You assumed I was too unsophisticated to notice." Sloane stared at me like she was seeing a stranger, her earlier contempt giving way to something rawer. Fear. "You planned this," she said. I nodded once. I verified it. "There's a difference." Security entered quietly at the edge of the room, not aggressive, just present. Phones buzzed, people whispered, a few guests slipped out, unwilling to be associated with whatever headlines were forming. Garrett stood suddenly, pushing back his chair. "This isn't fair," he said hoarsely, turning toward me. "You could have come to me." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt something like sadness settle in. "You never listened to me," I said. "You listened to who made you feel important." He had no answer for that. The screens went dark, not dramatically, just off. The damage had already been done. Act 3 ended not with shouting or arrests or collapse, but with something far more destabilizing to people like the Whitmores. Exposure, and the quiet understanding, settling over that ballroom like dust after a demolition, that the woman they had mocked, minimized, and ignored had not only seen them clearly, she had outgrown them completely. The thing about collapse is that it rarely happens all at once. What people call everything falling apart is usually a series of small realizations landing faster than the mind can process them. I watched that happen in real time, watched confidence drain out of faces that had never imagined being questioned, let alone cornered. The Whitmores weren't screaming, they weren't pleading, they were doing something far more revealing. They were calculating. Charles Whitmore was the first to try to move. He stepped toward the man with the tablet, his voice lowered now, controlled, as if volume alone had been the problem. "We can discuss this privately," he said. "There's no need to make a spectacle." The compliance consultant didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He simply held his ground. "This stopped being private when restricted funds crossed into entities under federal oversight," he replied. "At this point, discretion isn't yours to offer." That was when the final screen lit up. Not numbers this time, not emails. A timeline, clean, methodical, month by month. Arrows showing movement of money. Footnotes referencing clauses they'd assumed no one would ever read. The Whitmore family name appeared again and again, not as villains in a story, but as data points in a pattern that could no longer be explained away. Sloane's hand found Garrett's arm, gripping it hard enough that her knuckles went white. "Say something," she whispered urgently. "Fix this." Garrett looked at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and the look on his face wasn't love or anger. It was realization, the kind that comes when you finally understand the role you were cast in and how little agency you ever had. "I don't know how," he said quietly. That was the moment his engagement stopped mattering. My mother sank into a chair, her breath shallow, while my father stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Years of trust were unraveling inside him, not with a dramatic tear, but with a slow, painful disintegration. I stayed close, one hand on his back, anchoring him to something solid. A woman near the front, a donor, judging by her pinned smile and the way people deferred to her, cleared her throat. "I'd like clarification," she said, carefully. "Are we exposed?" Marianne Hales didn't hesitate. "If your funds passed through the Whitmore advisory channel during the periods indicated," she said evenly, "then yes, you are potentially exposed." That was when phones started coming out, openly. Not to film, to call lawyers. The illusion of unity shattered instantly. The same people who had laughed minutes earlier were now creating physical distance, stepping away from Charles and Elena Whitmore, as if proximity alone might contaminate them. Elena's composure cracked then, just slightly. Her chin trembled as she scanned the room, searching for allies who were already gone. "This is a misunderstanding," she said sharply, her voice pitched too high. "We were advised. We trusted professionals." Marianne met her gaze. "So did the people whose money you moved without consent." Security approached again, this time accompanied by the venue's legal representative. Polite, calm, relentless. "We need the Whitmore family to step into the adjacent conference room," the attorney said. "Immediately." Charles Whitmore bristled. "On whose authority?" The attorney glanced at me, just briefly. "The property owners." That did it. Sloane spun toward me, fury breaking through the fear. "You planned this!" she snapped. "You waited until everyone was watching." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I waited until it was verified," I said. "I waited until the consequences would be real." Garrett took a step toward me then, his voice rough. "You could have warned me." I held his gaze, steady and sad. "I tried for years to be taken seriously. You laughed it off. You told people I was simple. You told them I worked with my hands because I couldn't manage anything else." He swallowed hard. "I didn't want to hurt you," I continued. "But I wasn't going to let our parents be collateral damage to your arrogance." That was when my father finally spoke. "You let me sign things," he said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "You told me it was safe." Charles Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no version of this where he could explain himself without confessing. The conference room doors closed behind the Whitmores with a soft, definitive click. Inside the ballroom, the band packed up quietly. The catering staff froze, unsure whether to continue serving or begin clearing. Conversations hummed low and frantic, like static. Garrett stood alone in the middle of it all, engagement ring still on his finger, future evaporating by the second. Sloane had followed her parents without looking back. I walked over to Garrett then, not out of triumph, but necessity. Some truths deserve to be said face to face. "I didn't do this to punish you," I said. "I did it to stop it." He nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "I didn't think you were capable of something like this." I gave a small, tired smile. "That's what made it possible." Minutes later, the venue's attorney returned, her expression professionally neutral. "Law enforcement has been notified," she said. "Financial Crimes Division." No sirens, no handcuffs, just inevitability. My parents stood with me as the room emptied around us. No one congratulated us. No one apologized. People rarely do when they realize they were wrong. But something had shifted. The power dynamics that had defined my family for decades were gone. Not reversed. Dissolved. And for the first time, standing there in the quiet aftermath of a very public reckoning, I felt something unexpected. Not victory. Relief. Because Act 4 wasn't about revenge. It was about ending a cycle that should have broken years ago, and choosing, finally, to walk forward without carrying their delusions with me. By the time the ballroom emptied, it felt like a different place entirely. The music was gone. The laughter had evaporated. What remained was the soft hum of cleanup, staff stacking chairs, clearing glasses, restoring order to a room that had briefly forgotten what it was designed for. I stood near the edge with my parents, watching people avoid our eyes as they passed, each of them carrying away a private reckoning they would never speak aloud. Public collapses make people uncomfortable, especially when they reveal how easily confidence can be mistaken for credibility. My mother broke the silence first. Her voice was quiet, unsteady. "Why didn't you tell us?" I didn't answer right away. I knew what she was really asking. Not about the fraud, about the company, about the years I'd lived outside their expectations without correcting them. "Because every time I tried to explain who I was becoming," I said carefully, "I was told it didn't matter, so I stopped explaining." She nodded, eyes wet, absorbing that truth like a bruise she hadn't noticed forming. My father reached for my hand, his grip firm despite the tremor still moving through him. "You protected us," he said simply, "when I should have protected you." That was enough. I didn't need apologies stacked on top of each other. I didn't need rewritten history. What mattered was that the illusion was gone, and with it, the quiet hierarchy that had always placed my brother at the center and the rest of us at a distance from our own worth. Garrett didn't leave right away. He lingered near the doorway, staring at his phone like it might offer instructions. When he finally approached, his shoulders looked smaller somehow, his certainty stripped down to something human and uncertain. "They're gone," he said, meaning Sloane and her parents. "They told me not to contact them." I nodded once. That outcome had been inevitable. Families like theirs don't survive exposure by closing ranks. They survive by shedding weight. "I didn't know," he added, his voice low. "About the investments. About Mom and Dad's money. I swear." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Belief didn't absolve him, but it did clarify something important. He hadn't been malicious. He'd been careless with power he never questioned. "I should have listened to you," he said. "I spent so long thinking success sounded a certain way that I never noticed what it looked like." I didn't respond immediately. Some realizations need space to settle before they can do any good. "Take care of them," he said finally, nodding toward our parents. "I need time." He left without asking forgiveness. That mattered more than any speech he could have made. In the weeks that followed, consequences unfolded quietly, just as I'd planned. Investigations don't announce themselves with spectacle. They arrive in envelopes, in interviews, in court filings that speak without emotion. The Whitmore's empire didn't explode. It unraveled. Accounts frozen, partnerships dissolved, boards resigned, invitations rescinded. The kind of collapse that doesn't trend, but permanently changes who returns your calls. My parents moved slowly through the aftermath, grieving not just the money they'd almost lost, but the image of the family they thought they were joining. I set up protections, independent advisors, legal safeguards, systems that didn't rely on charm or trust, but on transparency and verification. They didn't argue this time. They listened. And me? I went back to work. Not as an escape, as a grounding. Early mornings, site visits, meetings where people spoke plainly, and results mattered more than perception. The same routines that had built everything they once mocked. The company continued to grow, steady and unglamorous in the best way. No whispers, no shortcuts, just systems that worked. I didn't attend another family event for a while. Not out of bitterness, but because healing isn't performative. It doesn't require an audience. When we finally sat together again, just us, no extended circles, no appearances to maintain, the conversation felt different. Quieter, more honest. There was grief there, and respect. New, fragile, but real. My mother asked me one evening if I'd ever resented them. I thought about it before answering. "I resented not being seen," I said. "But I don't anymore." Because here's the truth I didn't understand when I was younger. Self-reliance doesn't mean isolation. It means choosing not to beg for validation from people who don't know how to give it. It means building armor from patience instead of anger. It means letting facts speak when emotions would only invite dismissal. That night in the ballroom didn't give me my power. It revealed it. They mocked the country girl because they thought she was harmless. Because they thought simplicity meant weakness. They never understood that silence can be strategic, that humility can coexist with authority, that the person who doesn't announce themselves is often the one holding the keys. I didn't destroy them. I stopped protecting their lies. And when I walked away from that ballroom, from the whispers, the laughter, the collapse, I didn't feel victorious. I felt intact, grounded, certain of who I was without needing anyone else to confirm it. Every consequence has a beginning. Mine started the moment they underestimated me, and it ended with me choosing, finally, to stand exactly where I'd always belonged. Not in their shadow, not on their stage, but firmly on my own ground.